The Final Draft, a mystery thriller audiobook. Chapter 1. The first chapter was always the hardest. Eleanor Graves never wrote for pleasure anymore. The words felt foreign beneath her fingertips, her once effortless prose now a battlefield of doubt and hesitation. She sat in her study, staring at the blank screen, fingers poised over the keyboard, waiting for inspiration that never came. Outside, the coastal town of Ravenshollow slumbered under a shroud of mist, the distant waves whispering secrets against the shore. She used to love the quiet. Now it felt like suffocation. A knock at the door broke her trance. She frowned, glancing at the time, 9:47 p.m., too late for visitors. Ravenshollow wasn't the kind of town where people made unexpected calls, especially not at night. Slowly, she rose, brushing a strand of dark auburn hair behind her ear as she moved toward the door. The knock came again, firmer this time. Eleanor hesitated, hand resting on the doorknob. A flicker of paranoia crept in, but she shook it off. This was Ravenshollow. Nothing happened here. She opened the door.
Detective Inspector Daniel Cole stood on her porch, his trench coat damp from the fog. His presence felt oddly misplaced, like a misplaced character in the wrong scene. "Miss Graves," he said, his voice clipped but polite. "Apologies for the late hour."
Eleanor's pulse quickened. A detective, at her door, at night. Her mind conjured possibilities in an instant. Had something happened to someone she knew? Had her past somehow caught up with her? She started, but Cole didn't let her finish.
"We need to talk. It's about a murder."
Eleanor didn't remember making the tea. She only noticed the steam curling from the mug in front of her when she sat across from Cole at the kitchen table, her hands gripping the ceramic like an anchor.
"A woman was found earlier tonight,"
Cole said, placing a grainy black and white crime scene photo on the table. The dim lighting of her kitchen softened the edges, but the image was unmistakable. A body, sprawled against the rocky shore, dark liquid pooling beneath her. A familiar scene, too familiar. Eleanor's stomach turned cold.
"Why are you telling me this?"
She asked, though deep down, she already knew the answer.
"Because the murder matches the exact description of a scene in one of your books."
Silence settled between them, thick and suffocating. Eleanor swallowed. No, that wasn't possible.
"Which book?"
She asked, though she dreaded the answer. Cole reached into his coat pocket and placed a worn copy of Blood in the Fog on the table. Her first novel. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The body, the location, the exact position, everything was the same. Someone had followed her book like a script. Chapter 2. A story she never meant to write. Eleanor's first instinct was to rationalize. Chapter 3. The words she never wrote, rushed from her lungs. She dropped the paper as if it burned. The killer wasn't just copying her books. They wanted her to play along. Eleanor's past, the words that haunted her. She tried not to think about why she stopped writing. 10 years ago, she had been on top of the world. 4 best-selling novels, a contract for more, a reputation as a brilliant crime writer. And then, in a single night, it had all fallen apart. She never talked about it. The disappearance, the accusations, the way her final book, a manuscript she never finished, had been sealed away, unread. She had buried it, and now someone was digging it up. Her fingers tightened around the note, and for the first time since the murder, she felt something other than fear. She felt anger. Whoever this was, they thought they controlled the narrative, that she would just sit back and let them play out their twisted imitation of her work. Oh, they were wrong. Eleanor wasn't just going to wait for the next chapter to be written. She was going to write it herself. Chapter 4. The crime scene wasn't the only grave. Eleanor had been to plenty of crime scenes in her mind. She had written them in excruciating detail, pored over forensic reports, and crafted intricate webs of deception that left even the sharpest readers guessing. But standing at the edge of Margaret Howell's murder site, the cold wind biting at her cheeks, she realized something terrifying. This wasn't fiction. The tide had receded, leaving behind a damp, empty patch where Margaret's body had once been. A few police markers remained, half buried in the wet sand, and further up, near the jagged rocks, a single black feather fluttered in the wind. A crow, just like in her book. She glanced at the man standing beside her. Jacob Finch, journalist, opportunist, former friend. Jacob had been one of the few people she had trusted before it all fell apart 10 years ago. They hadn't spoken in years, until tonight. when she called him and said 5 words that guaranteed his interest.
I think it's happening again.
Now he stood beside her, hands shoved into the pockets of his worn jacket, watching her with the same analytical expression he had used in every interview he'd ever conducted.
You look like you've seen a ghost.
Jacob murmured.
I have.
He raised an eyebrow. She gestured at the scene.
This isn't the first time someone has done this.
Jacob's expression darkened.
You mean?
Yes.
Eleanor's throat felt tight.
10 years ago, the reason I stopped writing.
Jacob exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face.
Damn.
For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of old ghosts and fresh blood hung between them. Eleanor crouched, staring at the sand where Margaret's body had lain.
You remember the case?
She asked.
Of course I do. The Cassandra murders. A man killed 3 people exactly as you described in your 3rd novel. You were at the center of it. Hell, they nearly charged you.
Eleanor's fingers dug into her coat sleeves.
They never found him.
Jacob watched her carefully.
You think it's the same person?
Eleanor didn't answer, because she didn't know. Reopening old wounds. After leaving the crime scene, Eleanor drove straight to the station. She found Cole in his office, half buried in reports, looking like a man who hadn't slept in years. He glanced up, frowning when he saw her.
You again.
Eleanor didn't sit. She dropped the folded note onto his desk. Cole picked it up, unfolding the paper with careful fingers. His brow furrowed as he read. You wrote the beginning, Eleanor. Now write the ending. For the first time, he looked uneasy.
When did you get this?
He asked.
Tonight. Someone slipped it under my door.
Cole sighed and leaned back.
Well, that's disturbing.
Eleanor crossed her arms.
This isn't the first time this has happened.
Cole raised an eyebrow.
Excuse me?
She hesitated, then forced herself to say it.
10 years ago, someone copied my book's murders too. 3 people died.
Silent, then Cole swore under his breath.
They never caught him.
Eleanor said. Cole rubbed his temple.
And now he's back.
Or it's a copycat.
Eleanor said, though the words felt weak. Cole's gaze sharpened.
Or he never stopped.
A chill ran through Eleanor, because deep down, she had always feared the same thing. That the killer had never really disappeared. That he had been waiting. Chapter 5, the story no one wanted told. Eleanor hadn't set foot in a police station in over a decade. She had barely survived the scrutiny then, and now she was walking back into it, voluntarily. Detective Cole led her into a cramped office, lined with filing cabinets that looked older than he did. He gestured toward the chair opposite his desk, but Eleanor ignored it. She wasn't here to get comfortable.
You said the Cassandra murders were never solved.
He said, pulling up a file on his screen.
That's right.
Cole tapped a few keys. A series of black and white crime scene photos filled the screen. She had forced herself not to look at them for years, but now there they were, staring back at her like ghosts from a life she had tried to leave behind. 3 victims, all killed exactly as she had written them in the last lie.
Here's what I don't understand.
Cole said, watching her carefully.
The original killer, why did he stop?
I don't know.
But Jacob Finch might. She hadn't told Cole yet. Not about Jacob's reaction at the crime scene. Not about the way his expression had shifted when she brought up the Cassandra murders. She had known Jacob a long time. Long enough to recognize when he was hiding something. The warning. By the time Eleanor left the station, it was nearly midnight. The cold air was sharp against her skin as she stepped outside, wrapping her coat tightly around herself. She hesitated at her car, eyes scanning the street. Paranoia settled in. It wasn't safe. She knew that now. She yanked open the driver's side door, then froze. A single white envelope sat on her seat. Her stomach lurched. Slowly, she reached for it, fingers trembling. The envelope was unmarked, the paper thick and expensive. She flipped it open and pulled out the note inside. The words were typed, not handwritten.
Stay out of this, Eleanor. You don't want to end up like them.
Them. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She already knew who them meant. The Cassandra murders. She swallowed, scanning the street again. The night was too empty, too still. Whoever had left this, they weren't far. For the first time since this nightmare began, fear truly settled in. This wasn't just a twisted game. This was a warning, and she had no idea how many chapters she had left. Chapter 6, Unfinished Business. Eleanor didn't wait. The warning note still burned in her hand as she drove straight to Jacob Finch's apartment, gripping the wheel so tightly, her knuckles turned white. She should have thought this through. She should have waited until morning. But if there was one thing she knew about Jacob Finch, it was that he lied for a living. He was a journalist, and journalists only revealed what they wanted the world to see. And tonight, she was done waiting for the truth to come to her. The confrontation. Jacob's apartment was on the second floor of an old Victorian building, the kind that reeked of old money and secrets. She pounded on the door, ignoring the late hour, a shuffle of movement. Then, after a long pause, the door cracked open.
Eleanor?
Jacob frowned when he saw her. She pushed past him before he could protest, stepping into the dimly lit living room. Papers and books were scattered everywhere. A half-drunk glass of whiskey sat on the coffee table.
You could have called?
Jacob sighed, shutting the door.
No, I couldn't.
Eleanor turned to face him. She pulled the note from her coat pocket and tossed it onto the table. Jacob's eyes flicked to it. His expression barely changed.
That was waiting for me in my car,
She said.
Someone doesn't want me looking into this, and I think you know why.
Jacob exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face.
Eleanor?
No,
She took a step closer, her voice cold.
you knew back then, didn't you?
Jacob hesitated, and that was enough. Eleanor's stomach turned.
Oh my God, you did.
Jacob finally met her gaze, something dark and unreadable in his expression.
You don't understand.
Then explain it to me.
She snapped.
Because 3 people died 10 years ago. And now it's happening again.
Jacob ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly exhausted.
Cassandra murders.
He said.
I talked to police, to families. And yeah, I found something. Something I couldn't print.
Eleanor's breath hitched.
What?
Jacob hesitated, then lowered his voice.
The last victim. She knew the killer.
Eleanor's blood turned to ice.
What do you mean?
Jacob sighed.
The cops never said it publicly, but I found out the third victim, Lisa Carter. She had a connection to the suspect they were investigating. They just never had enough proof.
Eleanor swallowed.
Who was the suspect?
Jacob hesitated.
I don't know.
You're lying.
Jacob's jaw tightened.
I'm not. All I know is when I started asking too many questions back then, I got my own warning.
He gestured to the note.
Just like that.
Eleanor's hands curled into fists.
And you just let it go?
Jacob's voice was quiet.
I didn't want to end up dead, Eleanor.
She wanted to be furious. But the truth was, she understood. Fear had made her run from this once too. But she wasn't running anymore. The break-in. Eleanor didn't go home right away. She drove to the station first. She hadn't planned to, but before she knew it, she was sitting across from Detective Cole, her hands still trembling from the conversation with Jacob. Cole read the note twice, then looked up. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was firm.
We'll take this seriously.
Eleanor nodded, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding.
Good.
Cole leaned forward.
I need you to promise me something.
Eleanor raised an eyebrow.
You're not a detective. Don't do anything reckless.
Eleanor hesitated, then she lied.
Of course not.
When she got home, something felt wrong. She stood outside her front door, heart hammering, scanning the dark windows. Nothing looked out of place. The street was empty. The house was silent. But she knew something wasn't right. Slowly she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air felt different, the kind of stillness that didn't belong. She reached for the light switch. Nothing. The power was out. A prickle ran down her spine. Someone had been here. She moved cautiously through the living room, her pulse thundering. Then she saw it. Her bookshelves had been ransacked, pages torn from their bindings, covers thrown to the floor. And in the middle of the mess, something stood out. Her old, unfinished manuscript. The one she had never published. The pages had been rearranged, and scrawled across the title page, in dark red ink, were 4 chilling words.
You're part of this.
Out, leaving only the moonlight, casting jagged shadows over the scene. But none of that mattered, because in the center of the destruction sat her old manuscript, a story she had never finished, never published, never shared with anyone, and someone had rearranged the pages. She took a shaky step forward, kneeling beside the pile of papers. Her fingers skimmed over them, dread pooling in her stomach. Whoever had broken in, they wanted her to read this. Slowly, she turned the title page over. The first sentence had been changed.
The writer thought she could control the story, but stories have minds of their own.
Her breath hitched. That wasn't her writing. Someone had rewritten her words, taken her voice. She flipped through the pages, scanning for more alterations. The original draft had been a psychological thriller about a murderer who left messages for his victims before killing them, taunting them with their own past mistakes. But now, it was different. She stopped on a page near the end. New words had been added, slashed across the margins in thick black ink.
You think you know how this ends, Eleanor, but this time, you're not the author.
A chill ran through her. She swallowed, forcing herself to think logically. This was meant to shake her. It was meant to make her feel powerless. It was working. The threat. Then she saw it, tucked between the manuscript pages. A small, glossy photo. Eleanor's stomach twisted before she even picked it up. She knew what it would be. And she was right. It was a picture of her. Not a candid shot from the press. Not some author promo photo from years ago. No, this was recent. Taken tonight. She was in her car, gripping the steering wheel, her expression tense. It had been taken outside the police station. Someone had been watching her, following her. Eleanor's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. She let the photo slip from her fingers, landing among the wreckage on the floor. The message was clear. This wasn't just about the books anymore. She was next. The past comes back. She staggered back, her pulse a frenzied hammer against her ribs. And then, the memories came. 10 years ago. The Cassandra murders. She had buried them, locked them away, convinced herself she didn't remember enough to matter. But now, standing in the ruins of her study, it all started coming back. The last victim, Lisa Carter. Jacob had said Lisa knew the killer, that the police had a suspect but no proof. Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, a flash of memory. Lisa Carter, young, ambitious, terrified in their last conversation. Eleanor had met her once. Lisa had come to one of her book signings. She had wanted to talk, but Eleanor had brushed her off. And then, days later, Lisa was dead. Had she known something? Had she been trying to warn her? And if Lisa had been the key to the original murders, what did that mean for now? Eleanor's head spun. The killer had been waiting all this time, and now they were starting again. Chapter 8. Buried Truths. Eleanor didn't sleep. She sat at her desk, surrounded by the ruins of her study, and trying to keep her breathing steady. The photo of herself, taken just hours ago, lay face up on the desk like an accusation. Someone was watching her. Someone had been waiting for her to remember. She wasn't going to Jacob. Not yet. She needed someone who could give her real answers. Someone tied to the Cassandra murders who wasn't telling the full truth. And she knew exactly where to start. The last witness, at dawn. Eleanor parked outside a rundown cottage on the outskirts of Ravenshollow. The man inside was the only survivor of the Cassandra murders. Charles Dane. 10 years ago, Charles had barely escaped the third murder. He had been Lisa Carter's neighbor. He was there the night she was killed. But when the police questioned him, his answers had been vague, inconsistent. Eventually, they ruled him out as a suspect. But Eleanor had always wondered. She knocked hard on the door. No answer. She knocked again. Finally, slow, shuffling footsteps. The door creaked open, and a frail, hollow-eyed man peered out. His face had changed since the trial, thinner, worn by a decade of sleepless nights. His eyes, however, remained the same, haunted.
He recognized her immediately. Eleanor Graves, his voice was hoarse like he hadn't spoken in days. I knew you'd come.
Eleanor's stomach tightened because of the murder?
He hesitated, then nodded.
Come inside.
The hidden messages. The cottage smelled of dust and old paper. Charles led her into a dimly lit sitting room, where stacks of books and newspapers were piled high like tombstones. Then she saw them, her own books, every single one of them. Dog-eared, marked with sticky notes. A tattered copy of The Last Lie sat open on the table. Passages were circled in red ink.
Eleanor felt her breath catch. What is this?
Charles sat down heavily, rubbing a hand over his face.
I started noticing things after Lisa died. Your books, they're not just fiction, Eleanor.
She frowned. What are you talking about?
Charles flipped to a specific page and handed it to her. It was a passage from her novel, one she hadn't read in years. The game never truly ended. The writer just stopped telling the story.
Eleanor's blood ran cold. That was never in the original draft, she whispered. She had never written those words.
Charles nodded. I know. Because that line wasn't there when I first read this book. I checked. Then years later I read it again. And suddenly it was.
Eleanor's head spun. Had someone altered her books? Had the killer been leaving messages inside them for years, waiting for her to notice? And if so, what else had she missed? Another murder. Her phone buzzed against the table. She barely registered answering it before she heard Detective Cole's voice.
Where are you? His voice was sharp, urgent.
Eleanor gripped the phone. Why?
There's been another murder.
Her heart slammed against her ribs. Cole exhaled sharply.
You need to see this, Eleanor.
Who? She whispered.
A long pause. Then Jacob Finch. Chapter 9, Dead Men Tell No Tales. Eleanor barely remembered the drive to the crime scene. Her mind spun, replaying Jacob's words from last night. I got my own warning. Had he known this would happen? Had he been hiding something bigger than she realized? And if so, had the killer silenced him before he could tell her? The scene, expression was unreadable as she approached. She barely got a word out before he shook his head.
I shouldn't be letting you in.
She swallowed hard. But you will.
Cole studied her, then sighed.
Come on.
The apartment reeked of blood and ink. Eleanor's breath caught as she stepped inside. The scene was disturbingly familiar. Jacob sat in his desk chair, slumped forward, a deep gash across his throat. Blood pooled beneath him. His computer screen was still on, illuminating the mess with a faint glow. But it wasn't the body that made Eleanor's skin crawl. It was the walls. Words were scrawled in thick black ink across every surface, passages from her books. She felt the world tilt slightly as she read them. The truth is always buried beneath the bodies. A writer can never escape their own words. You should have seen this coming. This was straight from her second novel, The Final Edit. Jacob had been murdered exactly like the journalist character in her book, and that meant the killer was still following her stories. The growing suspicion.
Cole exhaled heavily.
Eleanor swallowed hard. This was deliberate.
Cole gave her a dry look.
No kidding.
She turned to him. No, I mean more than the others. This was a message for me. He's pushing me towards something.
Cole studied her, his sharp gaze narrowing slightly.
You keep saying he.
Eleanor stiffened. What?
You seem pretty confident it's a man.
She hesitated. It's just a feeling.
Cole didn't respond immediately. Then, after a beat,
Eleanor, this is the second person connected to you who's ended up dead.
She bristled. You're saying I'm a suspect?
Cole didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either.
I'm saying that you have a direct link to these murders, he said carefully. And I can't ignore that.
Eleanor's pulse thudded painfully. She needed Cole to believe her. But she could see it now, that small crack in his trust, that creeping doubt. And she knew exactly what the killer was doing. They were making her look guilty. They weren't just recreating her books, they were rewriting her story. Chapter 10. The Picture of Guilt. Eleanor knew she didn't have much time. Cole was already starting to distance himself, his usual open-minded skepticism hardening into something more dangerous. Doubt. She could see it in the way he watched her, measured her words, as if he was waiting for her to slip up. And that meant, if she wanted to find the truth, she had to act fast, before she ended up the main suspect in her own story. The hidden photo. Inside was a single photograph. Eleanor stared at it, her pulse roaring in her ears. It was a picture of Lisa Carter, the last victim of the Cassandra murders. But that wasn't what made Eleanor's blood run cold. Because standing next to Lisa, smiling at the camera like they were old friends, was Eleanor, rewriting the past. Her hands shook as she gripped the photo. This wasn't possible. She had met Lisa once, at a book signing. That was it. So why did this picture exist? And why did she have no memory of it? Jacob had hidden this. That meant he had known. But known what? Eleanor's head swam. Had she forgotten something? Or worse, had someone made her forget? The next message. She barely made it out of Jacob's apartment before she noticed it. A small, white envelope tucked under the windshield wiper of her car. Another note. Waiting for her. She glanced around. The street was mostly empty. No one watching. No one near. Her hands trembled as she pulled the envelope free. She didn't want to open it, didn't want to read it, but she did. And this time, there was no pretense of subtlety. The note was typed, cold, and final. You're running out of chapters, Eleanor. Time to write the ending. Losing trust, she gripped the note in her shaking fingers as she walked back toward Cole. He glanced at her, expression unreadable.
I found something she started, a picture of Lisa Carter with...
She hesitated.
With me.
Cole's entire stance changed. His arms folded, his face darkened.
Eleanor swallowed. I don't remember taking it.
Cole was silent.
Jacob had it hidden in his desk. She pressed. Why? What was he trying to tell me?
Cole exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples.
Jesus, Eleanor, first your books, then the murders. Now this?
His voice wasn't accusing yet, but it was close. Eleanor's stomach twisted. Cole was slipping away, and if she didn't figure this out soon, she wouldn't just be a suspect. She'd be the next body. Chapter 11, Framed in Shadows. Eleanor barely heard herself breathing. The photograph burned in her hands, as if the weight of its truth had a physical presence. Lisa Carter, dead 10 years, and standing next to her, Eleanor herself. She had tried to rationalize everything so far, tried to make sense of the murders, the messages, the game someone was playing. But this was impossible, because she had no memory of that day. So who had taken the picture? And why had Jacob hidden it? A suspect in her own story. Cole paced beside her car, his sharp blue eyes unreadable, but Eleanor could see the shift. Something in his posture, something in the way he looked at her now, as if she had become part of the case, not just a witness.
You don't remember taking this photo?
No.
She admitted.
I met Lisa Carter once at a book signing. That's it.
And you expect me to believe that?
Cole folded his arms. Eleanor's stomach twisted.
Jacob knew something. He hid this photo. He was trying to tell me something before he died.
Cole exhaled, shaking his head.
Eleanor, this is too much. The first murder followed your book. The second was someone you knew. And now there's a photo linking you to the last victim of the Cassandra murders?
You think I did this?
She clenched her fists.
I think,
He said slowly, measuring every word,
that either you're hiding something, or someone wants us to believe you are.
Eleanor's breath came shallow and uneven.
I'm going to have to ask you not to leave town.
Cole added. She felt cold all over. She wasn't just being watched by the killer now. She was being watched by the law. The photographer. She had to find out who took that picture. Jacob had hidden it for a reason. He must have found something about the Cassandra murders that linked back to her. There had to be an answer. She drove back to her house, her mind racing. Someone had been taking pictures of her recently, too. The photo left at her break-in. The one from outside the police station. It was the same pattern, the same game. She dug through her phone, scrolling through Jacob's last emails. Nothing useful. Then she checked her voicemail, and her stomach dropped. The voicemail. The message was left the night before Jacob was murdered. His voice came through, low and tense.
Eleanor, I found something. It's bigger than we thought. I can't talk here. I need to meet you. There's someone else in the background of that photo. Someone you won't believe.
A rustling noise, a deep breath, then lower.
They know I have it.
Click. The message ended. Eleanor's hands shook. Someone else in the photo? Had Jacob been killed because he found the photographer? Her heart hammered. She had to find the original picture, not just the cropped version Jacob had hidden. Because whoever was in the background, they were the key to everything. Chapter 12, Echoes from the Past. Eleanor had spent the last 10 years trying to forget Lisa Carter's murder. Now, it was the only thing she could think about. Lisa had been the third victim of the Cassandra murders, the one who, according to Jacob, knew the killer. And now Eleanor knew there was someone else in that photo, someone Jacob had found, someone he died for. She needed to go back, to where it all started. The neighbor who never forgot Lisa Carter had lived in a small rented house on the outskirts of town before she died. It was still there, empty, abandoned, its windows boarded up like it was trying to forget what had happened inside. But the house next door? That was different. A light glowed from inside. She knocked. The door creaked open, and an older woman peered out cautiously. Thin, silver-haired, dressed in a robe despite it being midday. Eleanor forced a small smile.
Mrs. Holloway?
The woman hesitated.
Who are you?
My name is Eleanor Graves, she said carefully.
She hesitated.
I'm looking into what happened to Lisa Carter.
The woman's face tightened.
Too late for that, isn't it?
Eleanor's pulse thudded.
Maybe not.
Mrs. Holloway studied her, then sighed.
Come in.
The conversation. The house was cluttered, filled with dusty furniture and shelves overflowing with books. Eleanor followed Mrs. Holloway to a small sitting area where the woman poured herself tea but offered Eleanor nothing.
So,
Mrs. Holloway said, settling into her chair.
You're the writer.
Eleanor tensed.
You know who I am?
A dry chuckle.
I watched the news, and I remember you from back then. The police were all over you after Lisa was killed.
Eleanor swallowed.
And what did you think?
Mrs. Holloway tilted her head.
I thought you knew more than you let on.
A cold wave washed over Eleanor. The woman sighed.
Lisa was scared before she died. I heard her on the phone the night it happened. She was yelling at someone.
Eleanor leaned forward.
Do you know who?
A slow shake of the head.
But I know what she said.
Mrs. Holloway's expression darkened.
She said, "You're lying. I know what I saw."
Eleanor's stomach clenched. Lisa had seen something. Something she wasn't supposed to. Something that got her killed. Mrs. Holloway sighed.
"I told the police, but they didn't seem too interested. Figured she was talking to a boyfriend or something."
Eleanor's fingers tightened around her coat sleeve. Lisa hadn't been talking to a boyfriend. She had been talking to her killer. The personal warning, Eleanor was halfway home when she saw it. Her house, her front door slightly open. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She had locked it. She was sure of it. She stepped inside slowly, blood pounding in her ears. Nothing looked disturbed this time. No ransacked shelves, no pages torn apart. But then she saw it. A single object sitting on her desk. Her old typewriter. She hadn't used it in years. It had been packed away in the attic, forgotten. But now it sat perfectly centered, a fresh sheet of paper loaded into the roller, and typed onto the blank page was a new message.
"We all lie, Eleanor, even you."
Her breath caught. The keys were still warm. Whoever had been here, they had just left. Chapter 13. Faces in the Dark. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was being played. Every clue, every message, every carefully orchestrated murder, it was all leading her somewhere. And the photograph of Lisa Carter with an unknown figure in the background, that was the key. Jacob had hidden it for a reason. And now he was dead. Someone didn't want her to see what he had found. But it was too late for that. She was already looking. The call her phone rang just as she was about to search for a high-resolution scan of the photo. Unknown number. Her stomach clenched. She let it ring once, twice. Then she answered. She didn't say hello. A voice filtered through the line. Low, distorted, deliberately altered.
"You should have left it alone, Eleanor."
Ice slid down her spine.
Who are you?
She asked, voice steady despite the fear creeping in. A soft chuckle.
"You already know the answer."
She gripped the phone tighter.
What do you want?
The line went silent. Then,
"Check the news."
the call ended. Eleanor's stomach twisted. Her fingers trembled as she opened a news app on her phone. And there it was.
"Local woman found dead in home. Police investigating possible link to recent murders."
A name. A name she already knew. Mrs. Holloway. The next victim. Eleanor's chest tightened as she sped through the winding roads back to Lisa Carter's old neighborhood. Too late. She was too late. Police cars lined the street, their flashing lights making the night feel even darker. She barely made it past the crime scene tape before a firm hand gripped her arm. Cole. His expression was unreadable, but his grip wasn't gentle.
"You shouldn't be here?"
He said, voice low, controlled. Eleanor shook him off, her heart pounding.
What happened?
His eyes locked onto hers.
"You tell me."
She stiffened.
What?
Cole sighed heavily.
"Mrs. Holloway was found dead in her living room an hour ago. No sign of forced entry, no struggle.
He hesitated, rubbing a hand down his face.
Just like the others."
Eleanor felt dizzy.
You think
Cole cut her off.
"You're connected to every single victim.
Cole said bluntly.
And now another person dies the same night you visit them. What am I supposed to think?"
Eleanor's head spun. She had talked to Mrs. Holloway just hours ago, and now she was gone. But there was one detail Cole hadn't mentioned. One thing she needed to know.
How was she killed?
She asked, voice quiet. Cole hesitated.
Then, just like in Whispered Lies.
Eleanor's stomach dropped. That was her first book, the one that had launched her career. And now, the killer was going all the way back to the beginning. Chapter 14. The First Draft of Murder. Eleanor knew the clock was running out. The killer wasn't just following her books anymore, they were retracing her career. First, Blood in the Fog. Then, the final edit. Now, Whispered Lies. The very first novel she had ever published. And now, Mrs. Holloway was dead. Eleanor had to see the crime scene for herself, before it was too late. The crime scene. Cole wasn't going to let her walk inside freely, but Eleanor had been writing about crime scenes for years. She knew how to slip past barriers. She waited until the forensic team was switching shifts, then ducked around the back of the house, slipping through the garden gate. The house was eerily quiet. The same place where, just hours ago, Mrs. Holloway had told her about Lisa Carter's last phone call. Now, the old woman was gone. Eleanor peered through the living room window, and there she was. Mrs. Holloway sat slumped in her chair, a half-empty teacup resting on the table beside her. No signs of a struggle, no violence, just stillness, poison. just like the character in Whispered Lies. Eleanor's throat tightened. The killer had been in this house, had watched her walk away, and then had killed again. She scanned the crime scene through the window, looking for something, anything, that didn't belong. And then she saw it. A book, sitting neatly on the table beside Mrs. Holloway's cooling tea, and it wasn't hers. A book that wasn't hers. Eleanor's breath hitched. She had written Whispered Lies. She knew what the cover looked like, but the book beside Mrs. Holloway wasn't hers. It looked the same, but the title was different. She couldn't read it from this angle, but her gut told her the truth before her eyes did. The killer had printed their own version, a rewrite of her past.
Before she could move, a sharp voice called out, "Eleanor Graves!"
She turned sharply. Cole, and he didn't look like a man who was willing to listen. Brought in. She had been in this position before, a small, sterile room, the weight of law enforcement suspicion pressing down on her shoulders. Cole sat across from her, arms folded. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her.
Finally, he exhaled. "Tell me what the hell is going on."
Eleanor forced herself to stay calm. I don't know.
Cole raised an eyebrow.
"That's not gonna cut it."
Eleanor swallowed hard.
He slid something across the table, a folder. Eleanor hesitated before opening it, and when she did, her entire world tilted. Inside was a collection of pages, printed emails, letters, some of them addressed to her, some from her. Except she hadn't written them. She scanned the words, her pulse pounding. They were letters to Lisa Carter, letters from Eleanor Graves, and they all said the same thing. "I warned you to stay quiet." Eleanor's breath hitched.
I didn't write these.
Cole's jaw tightened.
"That's what everyone says."
Chapter 15. A story she didn't write. Eleanor stared at the letters spread out before her, her pulse hammering. They looked real. The formatting, the signature, the phrasing, just formal enough to sound like her. But she knew the truth. She hadn't written a single one of them, which meant someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make it seem like she had. She swallowed hard, looking up at Cole. His suspicion had hardened.
I need a handwriting analyst, she said firmly.
Cole's expression didn't change.
"The emails weren't handwritten."
Metadata, she snapped. Whoever faked these letters had to create them somehow. If they were emailed, we can check the IP addresses. If they were printed, we can find out which printer was used.
Cole studied her.
"So that's your defense?"
He exhaled, rubbing his temple. He didn't believe her. Not fully. But she wasn't backing down. Because if someone had gone to this much trouble to frame her, it meant they were desperate, and desperate people made mistakes. Another body. The interrogation room door burst open before Cole could respond. A young officer stood there, looking flustered, pale.
"Sir," the officer said quickly, "we just got another call."
Cole tensed.
"What?"
The officer swallowed hard.
"There's been another murder."
Silence hung in the air for one sharp, horrible second. Cole stood so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. Eleanor felt her stomach drop.
Cole asked, voice tight.
The officer licked his lips.
A reporter from the Ravenshallow Chronicle."
Eleanor's chest constricted. Not another journalist. Not another one like Jacob. The officer looked down at his notes.
"Name's Gareth Holt."
Eleanor's breath hitched. She knew that name. A reporter who had covered her first novel's release. And now, just like Jacob, he was dead. Cole's eyes snapped back to her. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. She knew what he was thinking. Another victim. Another person connected to her. Eleanor's world was closing in fast, and the killer was pulling all the strings. A stranger who knew too much. Eleanor was still reeling when they let her out of the interrogation room. Cole had no choice but to release her. There was no evidence tying her to any of the murders. Not yet, but she could feel it. The trap was tightening. And then the stranger appeared. She barely had time to react before a thin man in his early 50s fell into step beside her outside the station.
"I've been following your work for years," he said casually.
Eleanor stiffened.
Excuse me?
The man adjusted his glasses, looking entirely too at ease.
"I know you didn't write those letters."
Eleanor's heart skipped. She stopped walking, turning to face him fully.
Who are you?
He smiled.
"Name's William Trask, retired investigative journalist."
Eleanor narrowed her eyes. And you just happen to believe me?
"Oh, I know you're being framed. I've been keeping track of your career since Whispered Lies. I even investigated the Cassandra murders, back when the police tried to pin them on you."
Eleanor's pulse pounded. Trask's face turned serious. Chapter 16. A Name from the Past. Eleanor had spent years studying people. It was second nature, reading their micro-expressions, the shifts in tone, the hesitation in their words. And as she studied William Trask, she knew one thing for certain. He wasn't lying. He was rough around the edges, tired, but there was no deception in his eyes, which meant he was telling the truth. And if he was telling the truth, he knew something that could change everything. The name. They sat in a quiet corner of a coffee shop, the air thick with the scent of roasted beans and baked goods. Trask stirred his coffee absently, watching Eleanor carefully. Then he leaned forward. Eleanor's stomach dropped. Nathaniel Rudd, a true crime author, a man who had made a career out of other people's tragedies. And most importantly, the man who had written a book about the Cassandra murders. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face.
You think Rudd is the one framing me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper.
Trask nodded.
Eleanor shook her head. Why?
Trask took a slow sip of his coffee.
Because, he said, setting his cup down carefully, his book wasn't just about the Cassandra murders.
Eleanor's pulse pounded. What do you mean?
Trask exhaled.
I mean, Nathaniel Rudd had an anonymous source, someone who fed him details about the murders, things the public didn't know.
Eleanor's stomach tightened.
And you think that source was the real killer?
Trask nodded. And now I think he's doing it again.
Cole's doubts. Eleanor barely had time to process the information before her phone buzzed. Cole, she answered cautiously.
Detective.
A sigh on the other end.
Where are you?
Out, she said simply.
A beat of silence.
I don't think you did this.
Eleanor froze. She had expected more accusations. More pressure. Not that. She swallowed.
What changed?
Cole exhaled.
The letters. We ran a check.
The metadata was wiped.
Cole said, professionally. Whoever made them didn't just copy your writing style, they covered their tracks, which means they wanted us to find them, but not trace them.
Eleanor closed her eyes. That was exactly what she had suspected. Someone was trying to make her look guilty, but not get caught themselves. Cole hesitated.
I still think you know more than you're saying.
Eleanor swallowed. I just found out a name.
Cole was silent for a long moment. Then tell me.
She hesitated. Then finally she spoke.
Nathaniel Rudd.
Chapter 17. The Man Who Wrote the Truth. Nathaniel Rudd had made a career off other people's nightmares. He didn't investigate crimes. He didn't solve them. He packaged them, rewrote them, shaped them into stories that sold. And now, Eleanor had to face him. Because if William Trask was right, if Rudd had been feeding off the Cassandra murders for years, then he wasn't just a storyteller. He was a player in the game. And she needed answers. The confrontation. Nathaniel Rudd's house wasn't what she expected. It wasn't some dark, looming place hiding secrets. It was a modern townhouse in the city, perfectly maintained, neat, unassuming, which made it worse. Because monsters didn't always live in the dark. Sometimes they blended in. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time. Then finally, footsteps. The door swung open. Nathaniel Rudd stood in the doorway, wearing a casual sweater, a glass of wine in his hand, his expression unreadable.
Well,
He said smoothly.
I can't say I was expecting you, Eleanor.
Her stomach tightened. He didn't look surprised. Not at all. She stepped forward, her voice low, steady.
We need to talk.
Rudd sipped his wine.
Do we?
Eleanor clenched her jaw.
I know you had an anonymous source for your book on the Cassandra murders.
A flicker of something, a crack in the performance. It was gone in an instant. Rudd smiled.
And if I did?
Eleanor's pulse pounded.
Then I want to know who it was.
Rudd studied her, taking another slow sip of wine. Then he stepped back.
Come inside, Eleanor.
Who was your source, Nathaniel?
His gaze darted toward the fire, panic flickering behind his eyes.
This isn't the time, Eleanor.
He coughed. She tightened her grip.
It's exactly the time.
Rudd cursed, wiping sweat from his brow.
You're insane.
I've been called worse. The flames climbed higher, devouring the curtains, crawling toward the bookshelves. Rudd's breath hitched. His whole life was in this house, his work, his notes, his research. And Eleanor knew exactly what he was thinking. If the fire spread, so would the evidence.
The Cassandra murders, Eleanor pressed, her voice low, firm, relentless. Who gave you the information?
Rudd coughed, his fingers clenching at his collar. Then finally he spoke.
Lisa Carter.
Eleanor's entire world tilted. Her grip on Rudd's arm loosened. The fire crackled around them, but suddenly it felt distant, unreal. Lisa Carter, the last victim of the Cassandra murders, the woman in the photo with Eleanor.
She was your source?
Eleanor whispered. Rudd nodded quickly.
She knew something. She came to me first before she died.
Eleanor's throat tightened. Lisa had reached out to Rudd before the Cassandra murders ended, before she was killed, before her name was added to the list of victims. Which meant Lisa Carter had seen the killer. And now, someone was killing again to keep her secret buried. Cole's arrival. The front door slammed open. A rush of fresh air burst into the burning house, carrying with it the hard, commanding voice of Detective Cole.
Eleanor!
Eleanor turned, coughing as the smoke thickened. Cole stood at the entrance, eyes wild with urgency.
What the hell are you doing here?
He demanded. Rudd sputtered, stumbling away from Eleanor. He choked.
We need to get out of here.
Cole didn't move. His gaze locked onto Eleanor. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She pointed at Rudd.
He just told me Lisa Carter was his source for the Cassandra murders.
Cole's expression flickered. Then he strode forward, grabbing Rudd by the collar and dragging him toward the door.
Out.
We're not done.
Rudd coughed.
Are you serious?
Eleanor didn't blink. Lisa Carter told you something before she died. Something big enough to get her killed. What was it?
Rudd wiped sweat from his brow, eyes darting to Cole, as if hoping for an escape. Cole didn't move. He was listening now. For the first time since this all started, he believed Eleanor, and Rudd could see it, which meant he had nowhere left to run. Rudd exhaled.
Fine.
He licked his lips, staring at the burning wreck of his home, as if trying to find the right words. Then he looked back at Eleanor.
She told me the Cassandra murders were a cover-up.
Eleanor's pulse hammered.
A cover-up for what?
She demanded. Rudd shook his head.
She never got the chance to say.
He let out a bitter chuckle.
Because she was dead 2 days later.
Eleanor's skin prickled. Lisa had tried to tell someone, and it had gotten her killed. The killer's message. The fire department was still working when a young officer hurried over to Cole. His face was pale.
You need to see this, sir.
Cole tensed.
What now?
The officer led them around the smoldering remains of the house, stopping at the charred remains of Rudd's driveway. Eleanor's stomach dropped, because someone had left a message. Written in thick black ash, smeared across the pavement, were 3 words. She knew too much. The world tilted. Cole swore under his breath. Rudd stared at the message, then back at Eleanor.
This is a joke, right?
His voice shook. Eleanor barely heard him. Her mind was spinning. The killer was still watching, still writing their twisted narrative. Lisa Carter had known the truth, and now Eleanor was dangerously close to knowing it too, which meant she was running out of time. Chapter 20. Closing in on the truth. Lisa Carter had died before she could reveal what she knew. Now, Eleanor was determined to finish what she started. The Cassandra murders weren't just a killing spree. They were a cover-up. Lisa had uncovered something. Something that had gotten her silenced. And now, Eleanor was next. Full protection. Cole wasn't taking chances anymore. He had moved past doubt, past suspicion. Now he was in full protection mode.
I'm assigning officers to your house,
He said bluntly as they left the fire scene. No arguments.
Eleanor folded her arms. I wasn't going to argue.
Cole sighed. Good. He hesitated, then added, softer, almost reluctant, I don't think this is just a serial anymore, Eleanor.
She met his gaze. It's not.
His jaw tightened, which means whoever's behind this, they have resources, connections.
Eleanor nodded. And they're getting desperate.
Cole ran a hand through his hair. Yeah, and desperate people do stupid things.
Eleanor exhaled slowly, which means I don't have much time.
Cole's expression darkened. He hated it. Hated that she was still running toward danger. But he didn't stop her, because they both knew she was the only one who could put the pieces together. The direct move. She had barely been home an hour when it happened. A knock at the door. Sharp. Deliberate. Eleanor froze. The officers Cole had assigned were stationed outside. No one should have been able to get through without them seeing. A chill crawled up her spine. She moved cautiously toward the door, peering through the peephole. Nothing. Just darkness. The street lamps flickered, casting long shadows along the sidewalk. Then, another knock. This time, softer, more insistent. Eleanor's fingers hovered over the lock. Her pulse pounded. She glanced toward the window, where she could just barely see one of the officers outside standing guard. Whoever was knocking, they weren't supposed to be here. She took a slow breath, gripping the door handle. Then, just as she was about to step away, a low voice came from the other side. Not a whisper, not a threat, but a single calm sentence.
"You've almost figured it out, Eleanor."
Her blood turned to ice. And then, silence. When she finally worked up the nerve to yank the door open, no one was there. Chapter 21. Running into the unknown. Eleanor didn't think. She acted. The second the door swung open to nothing but empty night, she bolted. Whoever had spoken to her was still close. They had to be. The street was too quiet, too still. The flickering street lamp cast long shadows across the pavement, warping shapes into something unnatural. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she scanned the darkness. A flicker of movement. A figure, slipping just beyond the glow of the streetlights. Eleanor ran. The chase. Her feet pounded against the pavement, her breath coming in sharp bursts. The figure ahead was fast, but not fast enough. She gained on them, her heart hammering, her body screaming at her to slow down, to think. But she couldn't stop now. They cut down a side alley, disappearing into the shadows. Eleanor pushed harder, rounding the corner, only to slam into someone. Hard.
She stumbled back, gasping as a strong hand clamped around her wrist. And then she saw his face. Cole. Eyes sharp, furious. "What the hell are you doing?" he snapped.
Eleanor gasped for breath. Someone was here.
Cole's gaze hardened. "And you chased them?"
Eleanor yanked her arm free. They spoke to me. They knew I was close to the truth.
Cole exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. "Damn it, Eleanor." Then his expression shifted. Less anger, more concern. "You could have been killed."
Eleanor swallowed. I couldn't let them get away.
Cole sighed. "You're part of this now."
Eleanor met his gaze. I always was.
The clue Cole led her back to her house, still visibly frustrated. The officers were on alert, searching the area, but they found nothing. Whoever had been here, they had vanished. But they hadn't left her empty-handed. Because when Eleanor turned back toward her doorstep, she saw it. A small envelope, sitting neatly just inside the threshold, as if it had been waiting for her. Eleanor's breath hitched as she picked it up. The paper was thick, expensive. Her name was written on the front, in her own handwriting. A chill slid down her spine.
Cole hovered behind her. "Open it."
Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she slid her thumb under the flap, pulling out the single piece of paper inside. Her stomach dropped, because it wasn't a message. It wasn't a threat. It was a page from her unpublished manuscript. A page she had never shared with anyone. And one line stood out, a line she hadn't written.
"You're writing my story now, Eleanor."
Her hands went cold. Cole took the paper from her, his jaw clenching.
"That's it," he muttered.
Eleanor looked up. What?
He met her gaze, his expression set like stone. "If someone wants you involved this badly," he said, "then we bring you in."
Eleanor blinked.
"You're officially part of the investigation."
Chapter 22. Into the Spotlight. Eleanor had spent her life writing about crimes. Now, she was living one. And she wasn't going to be a passive character in someone else's twisted narrative. She wanted in. All the way in. An active role. Cole wasn't thrilled.
"You're not a cop, Eleanor," he said flatly.
No, she shot back. But I know this case better than anyone. The killer is using me, my books, my past. You don't need a detective. You need someone who thinks like them.
Cole exhaled sharply. He knew she was right. Eleanor pressed harder.
They've been leading me through this from the beginning, she said, which means they want me involved. Fine. Let's use that. Let's make them think they're still in control.
A muscle in Cole's jaw ticked. He hated it, but he wasn't stupid. Finally, he nodded.
"Fine," he muttered. "But if we're doing this, we're doing it my way."
Eleanor crossed her arms. Agreed.
She was officially part of the case, but she had a sinking feeling she had been part of it long before today. A personal move. She didn't have to wait long for the killer to react, because later that night, she got a call from her own number. Her phone buzzed on the table, the screen flashing unknown caller. Eleanor stared at it. The ringing went on, echoing through the silence of her house. Finally, she picked up. She didn't speak. Neither did they. At first. Then, after a long pause, a voice filtered through the line, low, smooth, deliberate.
"It's time to stop pretending, Eleanor."
A sharp, horrible chill crawled up her spine. She swallowed.
Pretending what?
A soft chuckle.
"That you don't remember."
Her heart slammed against her ribs. She gripped the phone tighter.
What do you mean?
"You were always part of this. You just buried it."
Her breath caught. She felt it now. The cracks in her memory, the gaps. Something had been lurking in the shadows of her mind for years. Something she was never meant to remember.
But don't worry, the voice continued, almost pleased. I'll help you remember.
The line went dead. Eleanor sank to her knees. Because the worst part? She had a feeling they were right. Chapter 23. What she tried to forget. Eleanor couldn't ignore it anymore. The cracks in her memory, the whispers in the back of her mind. She had spent years writing about the past, other people's pasts. But now, it was time to confront her own. Because the killer was right. She had buried something, and she needed to dig it back up. The diary. She spent hours searching, digging through old boxes, tearing through the forgotten corners of her attic. And finally, she found it. A small, tattered leather-bound book, her childhood diary. Eleanor hadn't seen it in years. She ran her fingers over the cover, heart-pounding. Why had she stopped writing? Why had she hidden it away? She flipped through the pages. At first, it was just childhood memories. Innocent. Normal. But then, her pulse skipped. One entry stood out. The ink was darker, heavier, like she had written it with a shaking hand. Her breath hitched as she read it.
Something happened today. Something bad. But I can't tell anyone. He said if I do, they'll know what I did. I don't remember what I did. But he says I was there. He says it was my fault.
Eleanor's vision blurred. She felt like she was drowning. This was about the Cassandra murders. She had written this when she was a child, but that was impossible. The murders happened 10 years ago, not when she was a kid. So why had she written this? What had she forgotten? Full protection, like a prison. Eleanor was still sitting on the floor, gripping the diary, when her front door burst open. Cole. He had had enough.
This isn't up for discussion. You're under full protection. Now.
Eleanor looked up at him, dazed, shaken.
They called me. They told me I'd remember.
Cole's jaw tightened.
And did you? I don't care what you remember, Eleanor. I care about keeping you alive.
Eleanor's throat tightened.
And what if remembering is the only way to survive?
Cole didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. She wasn't just a target anymore. She was the endgame, and whatever she had forgotten was the reason people were dying. Chapter 24. Shadows of the Past. Eleanor was done waiting. She had spent too long letting this story unfold around her. Now, she was taking control. The diary had cracked open something inside her, something she needed to face, and there was only one person left who might have the answers. Her father. The confrontation. Eleanor hadn't spoken to Henry Graves in years, not since he had packed up and left town, retreating into quiet obscurity. But now, she stood on his doorstep, knocking hard enough to rattle the frame. She didn't know what she expected. Shock, confusion. But when the door opened and he saw her standing there, his face went pale, like he already knew why she had come. Eleanor's stomach twisted.
Dad?
Henry's mouth opened slightly, then shut. Finally, he sighed.
I was wondering when you'd come.
Eleanor stiffened.
So you knew?
The next message. She barely had time to sit before her phone buzzed. A text. Unknown number. Her breath hitched as she opened it. There was no message, just a photo of her and her father, taken just now. From outside the window, Eleanor's hands shook. She looked up. Her father was already staring at her phone screen. Then, slowly, he locked the door. The discovery that changed everything. Cole was back at the station, sorting through files, when the forensic report on the altered letters came in. He expected more dead ends, more frustrating manipulation. But this was different. The tech team had recovered a single, corrupted name buried in the metadata of one of the forged letters, a trace of whoever had altered them. Cole's pulse kicked up, because the name wasn't Eleanor's. It wasn't even someone connected to the current case. It was from a sealed file in the Cassandra murder investigation. The name was Lisa Carter. Cole's blood ran cold. Lisa Carter had died 10 years ago. So why had her name just appeared in a brand new crime? Chapter 25. Nowhere to run. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her phone as she stared at the text. Someone had taken a picture of her and her father, just now, which meant they were watching. Close. She looked up at Henry. His face was tight, unreadable. He locked the door without a word. Eleanor's stomach twisted. Something was wrong. The air in the room felt too still, too thick with unsaid things. She stood slowly, keeping her voice calm, even.
I should go.
Henry's jaw tensed.
Eleanor.
She took a step toward the door. His hand shot out, not hard, not violent, but firm, a warning. She froze. Henry's eyes searched hers, something desperate behind them.
You're not safe out there.
Eleanor's pulse hammered.
I don't think I'm safe in here either.
She yanked free before he could stop her and rushed for the door, fumbled with the lock, threw it open, and nearly collided with Cole. Straight to Eleanor. Cole had driven like hell was at his heels. The moment he saw Lisa Carter's name in the new forensic files, he knew Eleanor was in more danger than ever. He hadn't stopped for backup, hadn't wasted time trying to put the pieces together. He had gone straight to her, and now she was standing in the doorway of her father's house, looking pale, shaken. Cole's eyes flicked to Henry. The older man stood in the dim light, watching them both, expression carefully blank. Cole's instincts screamed.
What the hell is going on?
He demanded. Eleanor shook her head.
We need to go.
Henry stepped forward.
Eleanor?
But she was already moving past Cole. And that was when her phone rang. The call, unknown caller. Again, the same number from before. Cole's hand hovered over his gun.
Don't answer that.
Eleanor ignored him. She picked up. This time she spoke first. A pause, then a voice she recognized, low, amused.
Eleanor, running already, but you're so close.
Eleanor's breath caught. Cole was watching her like a hawk. She forced herself to stay steady.
What do you want?
The same thing you do.
Her grip tightened. A soft chuckle.
The truth.
Eleanor's stomach twisted.
The voice lowered, almost a whisper. You buried it once, but you'll remember soon.
The line went dead. Eleanor lowered the phone slowly. Cole's jaw clenched.
What did they say?
Eleanor looked at him.
They know I forgot something.
Cole's expression darkened. And Henry? Henry just looked tired, like a man who had known the truth all along. Chapter 26. The truth he tried to bury. Eleanor didn't run this time. She turned back to face her father. Henry sighed, rubbing a hand down his face, looking suddenly older, more fragile. But Eleanor didn't care. She stepped forward, voice sharp, unrelenting.
No more lies.
Henry exhaled, his shoulders slumping slightly.
I never lied, he said quietly. I just never told you the whole truth.
Eleanor's chest tightened. Cole crossed his arms beside her. He wasn't stopping this. Neither was she.
You knew Lisa Carter, Eleanor pressed, didn't you?
Henry hesitated. Then he nodded. Eleanor's pulse hammered.
How? She demanded.
Henry met her gaze.
She was my student.
A hidden connection. Eleanor felt like she had been punched in the gut. Lisa Carter had been his student? Henry ran a hand through his graying hair. Years ago. She was in one of my literature classes at the university. Eleanor's mind spun.
Why didn't you tell anyone? She asked.
Henry gave a hollow chuckle. Because I didn't think it mattered.
And now?
Henry sighed, looking at her, the way a man looks at something he wishes he could protect, but knows he can't anymore.
Now, he said softly, I think Lisa Carter knew something about you.
Eleanor's stomach dropped. The killer's next move. Cole's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and swore.
What? Eleanor asked, still reeling.
A crime scene photo, taken just minutes ago. Eleanor felt sick, because in the picture, sitting neatly on a blood-stained table, was her childhood teddy bear. Cole's investigation. Cole didn't hesitate anymore. Henry was hiding something, and Cole was done playing nice. He turned to Henry, his expression cold, calculated.
You're coming with me, Cole said.
Henry frowned.
I haven't done anything.
Cole's jaw tightened.
Then prove it.
He nodded toward the door.
Let's take a ride.
Eleanor's chest felt tight. Her father was connected to Lisa Carter. The killer was sending messages tied to her childhood. And Eleanor was running out of time to figure out why. Because if Lisa Carter had died knowing something about Eleanor, then the next body might be hers. Chapter 27, Buried Voices. Eleanor watched as Cole led her father away. Henry didn't fight it, didn't argue. He just went quietly. But Eleanor couldn't focus on that now. Because someone had just left her childhood teddy bear at a crime scene. And that meant the past wasn't just haunting her. It was hunting her, the lead at the crime scene. Eleanor drove fast. The scene was in an abandoned house on the outskirts of town, a place she had never been. But as she pulled up, the sight of flashing lights and crime scene tape sent a chill through her. The officers barely stopped her as she stepped under the tape. Because now, she wasn't just an outsider. She was part of this case. She spotted the bear immediately. A small, faded, stuffed animal sitting on a blood-streaked table. It looked exactly as she remembered it. Eleanor's breath hitched. She hadn't seen this bear since she was a kid. How did the killer have it? And why now? She picked it up carefully, her fingers trembling. And then she felt it. A lump, something stitched inside. She ripped at the seams until something small and crumpled fell into her palm. A piece of paper, a note, written in her own childhood handwriting.
I saw it happen.
Eleanor's chest tightened. Her own words, but she didn't remember writing them. She didn't remember any of this. But the killer did, and now they were making sure she did too. The next message. Eleanor barely had time to process the note before her phone buzzed. A text, no words, just a photo of her house, taken from inside. Her blood ran cold. She wasn't just being watched. The killer had been inside her home. Recently, maybe they still were. Chapter 28. The killer was here. Eleanor's hands shook as she stared at the photo on her phone. It was her house, taken from inside. Whoever had sent it, they weren't just watching her. They had been inside her home. Recently, maybe they still were. Her first instinct was to run straight there, but she forced herself to breathe. To think, instead she called Cole. Cole's discovery. He answered on the first ring.
Eleanor?
His voice was tense, on edge.
They were inside my house, she said, gripping the phone tightly. I just got a photo taken from inside.
Then,
Stay where you are.
Eleanor swallowed. Cole?
No, stay where you are. I just got something too.
Eleanor's breath hitched. What?
Cole exhaled sharply.
Your father just admitted something.
Eleanor's stomach clenched.
What did he say?
Cole hesitated.
He said he knows why you don't remember.
Eleanor's skin prickled. She felt suddenly lightheaded, like the air had thinned.
Eleanor,
Cole's voice was softer now, careful.
I think we need to have a very different conversation.
The house. By the time Cole arrived, officers were already clearing her house. Eleanor knew the truth. The killer was long gone. Still, the feeling of violation lingered. She stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath her. Nothing was obviously disturbed, but then she saw it. A mirror in her living room. Someone had written on the glass. Not with blood, not with ink, with her own lipstick. 2 words.
Keep digging.
Eleanor's breath caught. This wasn't just a warning. It was a challenge, and she was about to find out exactly why she had forgotten. Chapter 29. A truth she can't escape. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She was done waiting. She was done running. Henry Graves had been holding the truth hostage for years, and tonight he was finally going to talk. The confrontation. Cole was waiting for her at the station, arms crossed, expression unreadable.
He's in interrogation,
He said simply. Eleanor pushed past him. She stormed into the room, her father seated at the metal table, hands folded neatly in front of him. He looked up, saw her, and sighed, like he had been expecting this. Eleanor slammed the diary onto the table.
Tell me why I wrote this.
Henry stared at it. Then he looked at her, and for the first time, his mask cracked. A memory trigger. Henry didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for something in his pocket, a small metal object. Eleanor's stomach twisted the moment she saw it. A key. Rusty, small, worn down with age. But the second it hit the table, everything shifted. Eleanor's breath hitched, her skin prickled, the metal, the weight, the coldness against her palm. Something clicked in her brain. A memory, blurred, distant. But there, a door, a locked room. A voice, Lisa Carter's voice, saying something urgent, something panicked. And then, the sound of screaming. Eleanor's entire body went rigid. She gasped, gripping the edge of the table as flashes of the past slammed into her. The key, the door, and what had been on the other side. A secret buried. Henry watched her carefully.
You remember now, don't you?
He said softly. Eleanor's chest tightened.
I was there.
She whispered. Her father nodded. Eleanor felt sick. Lisa Carter's death. The Cassandra murders. The killer wasn't just taunting her. They were making her remember. Because she had seen something. Something she had forced herself to forget. And now, the truth was clawing its way back. Chapter 30. No More Lies. Eleanor's breath shook as she gripped the edge of the table. She had spent weeks chasing shadows. Now, she was staring one in the face. She didn't look away.
Tell me everything.
Henry's hands tightened into fists.
I don't think you're ready.
Eleanor's pulse pounded.
I don't care.
Henry sighed heavily, his gaze tired, resigned. Then finally he spoke. The truth at last.
It was 10 years ago.
Henry said.
You were 17.
Eleanor's breath caught. She had thought she was younger, a child, but she wasn't. She had been old enough to remember.
There was a night, one you never spoke about. You came home late, shaking, covered in dirt.
Eleanor's stomach twisted.
You said you had seen something, but you wouldn't tell me what.
He exhaled.
The next day, Lisa Carter was dead.
Eleanor felt like the air had been knocked from her lungs. Lisa Carter, the girl in the photo with her, the one who had been trying to warn people. Henry leaned forward.
You locked it away, Eleanor. You forced yourself to forget.
Eleanor's head spun.
What did I see?
She whispered. Henry hesitated. Then he slid something onto the table. Another object from her past, a folded piece of paper. The edges were worn and fragile. Eleanor's fingers shook as she unfolded it. Inside, written in rushed, scrawled handwriting, her handwriting, were 3 words. I saw everything. Eleanor's vision blurred, because now she was starting to remember. The killer's direct warning. Her phone buzzed violently on the table. Cole grabbed it first. Unknown number. Again. He put it on speaker. Eleanor's throat tightened as she braced herself. Then the voice.
It's coming back to you now, isn't it?
Eleanor gripped the table. She could hear the smile in their voice.
But I can't let you remember everything, Eleanor.
Pause.
Not yet.
Eleanor's blood ran cold. Then, the sound of footsteps, a door creaking open, a voice in the background, a woman, muffled, panicked. Eleanor's stomach dropped, because she knew that voice. Cole stiffened beside her.
Who is that?
Cole demanded.
The killer chuckled softly. Let's just say she's another reminder of the past.
The call cut out. Eleanor's pulse slammed against her ribs. Whoever the killer had just taken, it was someone from 10 years ago, and Eleanor had just run out of time. Chapter 32. Breaking the lock. Eleanor couldn't wait any longer. Madeline was out there, taken, and the only way to find her was to remember what she had buried. No more hesitation, no more fear. She needed to force the door open. Forcing the memory, Eleanor sat at the table, hands gripping the photo. Her own face stared back at her, younger, unburdened. Lisa Carter, Madeline Cross. And her. A memory lurked just out of reach, wrapped in shadows. Something about that night. Something she had seen. She closed her eyes, forced herself to go back. And suddenly, she was there. 10 years ago, the air was thick with summer heat. Crickets hummed in the grass, and Eleanor was running. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she pushed through the trees, her breath sharp, panicked. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. A voice rang out behind her.
Eleanor!
She turned. Lisa Carter, standing at the edge of the clearing, wild-eyed, frantic. Lisa's clothes were streaked with dirt, her hands were shaking, and then she grabbed Eleanor's arms.
You didn't see anything.
Lisa whispered.
Do you hear me? You didn't see anything.
Eleanor's chest heaved. Lisa's fingers dug into her skin.
Promise me.
Eleanor's throat tightened, and then another voice, a low, cold voice.
Too late.
Present day. Eleanor gasped, her eyes snapping open. She was shaking. The memory rushed back in full force. Lisa had been trying to protect her, but from what? Or who? Cole's voice cut through the fog.
We just got another message.
Eleanor's stomach dropped. She turned toward him.
What does it say?
Cole's jaw tightened. He held up his phone, letting her read the message. It was short.
You saw it happen, so let's see if you can find her.
Below it, coordinates, a location. Eleanor's breath caught. The killer was leading her there. To the place it all started. To where Lisa had screamed and where Madeline was now. The last secret, before Eleanor could move, Henry spoke.
There's something you still don't know.
Eleanor stiffened. She turned to face him, pulse hammering. His eyes were heavy with guilt.
When you came home that night,
he said slowly,
you weren't just scared.
Eleanor's stomach twisted.
You were covered in blood.
Silence crushed the room. Eleanor felt like the air had been knocked from her lungs. She was shaking her head before she even knew why.
No,
she whispered.
That's not possible.
Henry's expression didn't change.
I cleaned you up,
he said.
I washed your clothes. I took your diary. I made sure you never remembered.
Eleanor's vision blurred. Her voice barely came out.
Why?
Henry's throat bobbed.
Because I didn't know,
he admitted.
I didn't know if it was your blood.
His gaze darkened.
Or someone else's.
Eleanor's head spun. Her body went cold. She had seen something that night. She had seen Lisa Carter's killer. But now, a new question loomed. One she didn't want to ask, one she couldn't ignore. What if she had done more than just witness it? What if she had been part of it? Chapter 33. The place it all began. Eleanor didn't stop to think, didn't stop to process. She just moved. She had spent too long chasing this mystery, too long letting her own mind betray her. Madeline was out there, and the only way to find her was to face whatever waited at those coordinates. The drive into darkness. Cole was tense beside her as she drove. He was gripping his gun, eyes narrowed, calculating. And Eleanor knew what he was thinking. He had believed her before, had trusted her instincts. But now, he was questioning everything, including her. And Eleanor couldn't blame him, because she was starting to question herself too. The trap. The coordinates led them deep into the woods. The place was too familiar, too heavy with memory. Eleanor knew this place. It was the same place from her vision, where Lisa Carter had screamed. Cole parked, his fingers tightening around his gun.
"We're walking into a trap?"
He said.
I know.
A soft, muffled noise.
"Did you hear that?"
Cole stopped.
Yes.
Eleanor nodded. Then she saw it. A rope tied to a tree, and hanging from the rope, a blindfolded, bound figure. Eleanor's breath hitched. It was Madeline. Her clothes were torn, her hands tied behind her back. She was alive. Barely. Eleanor raced forward. Cole yelled behind her, but it was too late. The second she touched the rope, the ground collapsed beneath her. Buried truth. Eleanor hit the earth hard. Dirt rained down as she landed in a deep pit, her flashlight rolling away into the shadows. Above, Cole's voice shouted her name. Then another sound. Footsteps. Eleanor froze. A shadow loomed above the pit. A figure standing at the edge. A voice. Low, familiar, chilling.
"You really should have remembered sooner, Eleanor."
Eleanor's blood ran cold. Because now she knew. The killer, the one who had been toying with her, leading her here. They had been beside her all along, watching, waiting. And now it was time to finish the story. Chapter 34. Face to Face with the Truth. Eleanor knew before she looked up. She didn't need to see their face, didn't need to hear another word. Because the second the voice cut through the night, something clicked into place. Something she had been trying not to admit. She recognized them. The killer. The one who had been tormenting her, leading her, playing with her memory like a puppet on strings. And when she lifted her head, she looked straight into Cole's eyes. Betrayal runs deep. Cole stood at the edge of the pit, expression unreadable. His gun was gone. Blood dripped from his temple. His hands were tied behind his back. He wasn't the killer. He was the next victim. Eleanor's breath hitched. And then, the real killer stepped into view. A familiar, lean figure. The last person she had ever expected. Nathaniel Rudd, the true crime author. The man who had made a career out of the Cassandra murders. The man who had always been just a little too close. Eleanor's stomach twisted, because it all made sense now. Nathaniel had never just been writing the story. He had been finishing it. Madeline's revelation. A choked sob pulled Eleanor's focus. Madeline, still tied to the tree, her face streaked with dirt, her wrists raw from the ropes, her wide eyes locked onto Eleanor. And then, she spoke.
You were there, Eleanor.
Eleanor's blood ran cold.
You saw it?
Madeline gasped, voice shaking.
You saw him kill Lisa, and you told me. You begged me not to say anything.
Eleanor's vision blurred. The memories rushing back like a flood, the screams, the blood, Lisa's body falling to the ground, and Nathaniel Rudd standing over her. Eleanor had seen it happen. And then, she had buried it. Nathaniel smiled, slow, satisfied.
"It took you long enough,"
he said, crouching at the edge of the pit.
"I was beginning to think you'd never remember."
Eleanor's chest heaved.
"I did."
And you framed me for it.
His smile widened.
"Not at first,"
he admitted.
"but when you buried the truth so deep that even you didn't remember, well, that was an opportunity I couldn't resist."
Eleanor fought against the rage rising in her chest.
You wrote about the Cassandra murders?
She said, voice steady despite the pounding in her head.
"Why?"
Nathaniel chuckled.
"Because I wanted to see if you'd figure it out,"
he said.
"And now you have, but unfortunately..."
He reached into his pocket, pulled out a knife. You won't live long enough to tell anyone. Chapter 35, The Final Move. Eleanor's pulse pounded as Nathaniel twirled the knife between his fingers. She had to stay calm, think, look for an opening, because if she panicked, she was dead. And if she died, so did the truth. Stalling for time, Eleanor took a slow breath, forcing her voice to stay steady.
You spent 10 years waiting for this moment, she said. Why not enjoy it a little longer?
Nathaniel's smile widened.
"Oh, I have enjoyed it, Eleanor."
He crouched at the edge of the pit.
"Watching you chase your own past, watching you question yourself. That was the real entertainment."
Eleanor's fingers curled into the dirt. She scanned the pit, looking for anything she could use. The walls were too steep to climb. The flashlight she had dropped earlier was still in reach. Not a weapon, but a distraction. She just needed an opening. But she wasn't the only one playing for time. Cole breaks free. A sharp movement caught Eleanor's eye. Nathaniel hadn't noticed. But Cole? Cole was working the ropes loose. His wrists were slick with blood, the rope biting into his skin. But he didn't stop, didn't even flinch. Eleanor felt a flicker of hope. If she could just keep Nathaniel talking a little longer, then Cole would be free, and Nathaniel wouldn't see it coming. Madeline's last secret. Then Madeline spoke, and her words shattered everything.
You were never supposed to kill her, she said.
Nathaniel froze. Eleanor's stomach tightened. Madeline's eyes locked onto Nathaniel.
Lisa wasn't the target, she whispered. Eleanor was.
Silence. Eleanor's breath caught. Nathaniel's expression flickered. Not surprise, annoyance. Like Madeline had just spoiled the ending of his favorite book.
Oh, Madeline,
He sighed.
you always talk too much.
Eleanor's blood turned to ice.
Is it true?
She whispered. Nathaniel's smile returned.
Oh, come on, Eleanor, you're a writer. Think about it.
He leaned forward.
Lisa Carter got in the way. She wasn't supposed to die that night.
Eleanor's throat tightened.
But I was?
Nathaniel nodded.
You saw something you shouldn't have. I was going to erase you before you could talk. But Lisa? She tried to protect you, got herself killed instead.
Eleanor's vision blurred. Lisa had died because of her, because she had tried to save Eleanor's life.
You really should have died that night.
Then he jumped down into the pit. Chapter 36, the final chapter. Nathaniel landed hard in the pit, dust kicking up around him. His knife glinted in the dim light. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She lunged for the flashlight, fingers closing around the cool metal. Nathaniel grinned.
No way out, Eleanor.
I am done being afraid of you.
Eleanor felt something shift. For the first time in 10 years, Nathaniel wasn't in control. The end of the story. Cole hauled Nathaniel up, slamming him against the pit wall. Nathaniel laughed, coughing.
You think this changes anything?
He sneered.
The story's already written.
Eleanor stepped forward. Her pulse was steady now.
No,
She said.
I'm writing the ending this time.
Nathaniel's smile faltered. For the first time, he looked afraid. And that was when the sirens cut through the night. The cavalry had arrived, and Nathaniel Rudd's story was over. Epilogue, a new beginning. It took days for everything to settle. Nathaniel was in custody. The truth was finally out. Lisa Carter had died saving Eleanor. Madeline had spent 10 years living in fear of a ghost. And Eleanor? She had survived. She sat in her study, staring at a blank page. And then, for the first time in years, she picked up a pen. Because this wasn't just her past anymore. It was her story. And she was going to tell it. The right way. The end.